Alright, so we'll say good morning. Today's daf is Yud 10. We are picking up on Testament Bays 9b, and we are picking up 2, 4, 6 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, we're dealing with the interesting case of machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. If I go ahead and I collect payah on behalf of my friends, or I collect payah and I say this is for my friend Harezeh Laploni, Rabbi Eliezer says it works. The Chachamim say it does not work. The Gemara originally wanted to suggest that Lamaisa, the case is where an Ashir is collecting it on behalf of the Ani. And remember, the reason Rabbi Eliezer says it does work is because you could use 2 migos. Chachamim say it doesn't work because the Chachamim say at most you could use 1 migo, not 2 migos. But in the case, ultimately, again, of where it's an Ani for an Ani, the Gemara seems to say that it would work. So Ula said, Rav Nachman said to Ula, but why not say that even in the case of one Ani acquiring for another Ani, it should also be a machlokes? How so? The Metzia, because I will say, if you take, for example, the case of Metzia, the case of the lost object, or I should say the found object, Hakol Aniyim Etzla, I will say everybody is considered to be poor when in relationship to a found object. What does that mean? Because again, no one has the found object represents something that no one has possession of. So because of that, everybody is considered to be an ani legabe, a lost object, and yet we learned Utanan hayroche v'gabi behema v'ras hamatzia v'amar lechaver tunali. Yeah, we learned in our Mishnah, we learned yesterday that if Reuven's riding on an animal and he tells Shimon, "Do me a favor, pick up, right? Go ahead and give me that object." Not lava amra ani zachisibah. If Reuven picks it up and says, "Listen, I picked it up, and I know you told me to pick it up, but I picked it up on behalf of myself," Shimon ultimately acquires it. So I'll say, if you say that the machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim is even in a case of an ani acquiring on behalf of an ani, then top of Yom Aleph, then masnis in money Rabbanani. Then I will say our Mishnah will reflect the view of the Chachamim. The Gemara should call them the Rabbanan. Elei amrit ba'ashir va'ani machlokes. But if you say that the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim is only in a case of a rich person who's acquiring on behalf of the poor person. And the reason is machlokes in that case is because Rabbi Eliezer says you could say 2 migos, and the Chacham say you could only say 1 migo. So the Gemara says, Divrei hakol zachalo. Everyone will agree that Lamaisa, again, the first Ani has acquired on behalf of the second Ani. So the Gemara says, Hamani, then whose opinion would our Mishnah reflect? Lo Rabbanan, velo Rabbi Eliezer. It would not be the Rabbanan, nor would it be Rabbi Eliezer. So how do you understand that the Mishnah? We'll say Yud Amud Aleph, 4 lines down from the top. Amarle mas nisin da amar tchila. Oh, so we'll say, to which the Gemara answers, the Mishnah's case is where he said tchila. Tchila means, we're supposed to say, just to get our names down. Reuven's on the animal, Shimon's walking on the ground next to the animal. Reuven sees the Metzia, tells Shimon, can you please pick up that Metzia for me? So we'll say, what's the case over here? The Gemara suggests that Shimon ends up acquiring it on behalf of his own, and Shimon says to Reuven, tchila, I never picked it up for you. As it turns out, from the moment that I picked it up, tchila, from the first moment that I picked it up for who? I picked it up for myself. I never had you in mind. Look at Rashi. The third line is down from the top in Rashi. Damar tchila. Hi ani zachisi ba di ka'amar tchila ka'amar lei. So we'll say when Shimon says to Reuven, I'm sorry, I know you told me to pick it up, but I ended up picking it up on behalf of myself. So he says, Kam le mitchila higbasi letzarchai. I picked it up for me. Velo letzarchecha. And I never had you in mind. So both say it could be that under normal circumstances, when you pick something up on behalf of someone, then they would acquire it. The reason in the Mishnah's case, Shimon, the guy who's on foot, is able to acquire it, even though Reuven, the guy in the animal, told him to pick it up, is because Shimon says, listen, Reuven, thank you for pointing out the Metzia. The bad news is I never had you in mind. The moment I saw that Metzia, more importantly, the moment I picked up that Metzia, I picked it up on behalf of myself. I never had intention to acquire it on your behalf. So the Gemara says, Hachanai mistabra. This would appear to be a good interpretation, a clear interpretation of the Mishnah. Diktani seifa, because if you look at the end of the Mishnah, what does the Mishnah say? Im mishnasnalo amarlo ani mishnasnalo Amar ani zachisi ba tchila. So we'll say. So what does the end of the Mishnah say? That if when Shimon gave it to Reuven, he said, "I had acquired it already for myself from the beginning." Lo amar klum. Then remember again, under that case, Shimon's statement is meaningless. Because we'll say, in that case over here, remember, Shimon's making his statement when? After he's already handed it over to Reuven. So at that point in time, that statement is meaningless. To which the Gemara says, Tchila b'seifa lamali. Why does the Seifa have to add in that word Tchila? In other words, we'll say if you look at the wording over here, Shimon, who's the guy on foot, says to Reuven, after he handed over the object to Reuven, I just want to tell you, Ani zachisi bat Tchila. I acquired it for myself from the beginning. Why do you need that extra word Tchila? To which the Gemara says, Tchila b'seifa lamali, pshita afal gav delo amar Tchila, Tchila ka'amar. We'll say, even if Shimon were not to articulate the word Tchila, it's obvious that that's his claim, right? His claim is, I know I just handed it over to you, but I had it in mind for me to acquire it from the beginning. Rather, I will say, it must be that the reason why the Seifa adds in the word Tchila is to also highlight the fact that the first case in the Mishnah is also dealing with a case of Tchila. So the first case in the Mishnah, I will say, where Reuven's on the animal, says to Shimon, do me a favor, give me that Metzia. Shimon picks it up, and he says, it's mine, because I acquired it on behalf of myself, Tchila. The idea being over here that Lamaisa, the reason why Shimon never ends up acquiring it on behalf of Reuven is why? Because in the moment that Shimon picked it up, he had it in mind for himself. But Rabbi said the inference from that would be that Einach Inami had Shimon had Reuven in mind, then what? Then Reuven could have acquired the item on behalf of Shimon's acquisition. So the Gemara says, V'idach, the other opinion, namely Rav Nachman would say, V'idach, Tana Seifa legaluye Reisha. The Seifa is coming to shed light on the Reisha. Seifa da'amar Tchila, because it's only in the second case of the Mishnah where Shimon actually handed over the object to Reuven, and he says Tchila. Then, even though he says Tchila because he handed it over, we no longer believe his claim. Reisha delo amar Tchila. But the first part of the Mishnah is where Tchila was not stated. Rav Nachman, Rav Chisda, so Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda both say, "Hamakbia Metzia lachaver lo kana chaveram." So both say. So now again we have a counter opinion. Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda both say that even if you pick up an object on behalf of your friend is not kona it. Your friend is not kona it. My timer. So we'll say, why not? In other words, again, remember, Mr. Stem was just saying before we started the shir. This would seem to be that this logically should work because of Zachem Ladum Shalom B'Fanov. Right? After all, again, we have the concept I could perform something objectively beneficial on behalf of someone, even without their knowledge or consent. It has to be objectively beneficial. But again, if I find $100 bill on the ground and I pick it up on behalf of Reuven, why wouldn't Reuven acquire it? Yet, Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda say that if you pick up a Metzia, a found object, on behalf of your friend, he does not acquire it. What is the reason for that? My taima, have tofes lebalchov b'makom shechav la'achirim. Because remember, we spoke about this on the first day of Yom Tiv. So just to give you the illustration of this case, so remember again, let's say Reuven owes Shimon money. Reuven owes Shimon money. So what happens? I see that Reuven is selling off his assets or is going out of town. So I seize a piece of Reuven's property with the intention of giving it to Shimon. Meaning I'm friends with Shimon. Shimon's the creditor. I want to seize a piece of Reuven's property, the debtor, to give it to Shimon. Only one problem. Shimon's not Reuven's only creditor. Right? Reuven has a bunch of other creditors as well. So even on a technical level, I should be able to seize a piece of Reuven's property to go ahead and pay it off to give it to Shimon, because here's the problem. The seizure on behalf of Shimon puts the other creditors at a disadvantage. And essentially we only say that you could do something of objective benefit for someone without their knowledge when it does not put anyone else at a disadvantage. But when your actions put someone else at a disadvantage, you are not permitted to act of your own volition on behalf of one interested party.
Like I said, doesn't work with the Metzia.
I'm sorry? No. So the Metzia is considered to be, according to Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda, is considered to be a detriment, meaning if I acquire that on behalf of one person, that's considered to be a detriment to others. Why? Because technically speaking, everyone has equal rights in that Metzia. Because it's Hefker. So by me going ahead and acquiring it on behalf of one party, I'm technically depriving other parties of the right to acquire that object, and therefore it's a detriment to other potentially interested parties, and therefore you can't apply the concept of Zachin. And when one seizes property due to a creditor in a place where the individual has other creditors as well, such an acquisition does not acquire. Now, I will say again, I want to be clear, this is only talking about a case where the individual is acting of his own volition. If I go ahead and I see a Metzia and I appoint a Shaliach, then my Shaliach could act on my behalf. This is talking about where the Shaliach, so to speak, it's not really a Shaliach, but the person is acting on his own volition on behalf of someone else. That works fine as long as you're not putting others at a disadvantage. But because at least according to Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda, you are putting others at an advantage because you're taking away their ability to acquire the Metzia. Therefore, you cannot acquire a Metzia on behalf of someone else. It says the Gemara, Eisei Rav Nachman. So Rav is Kesher to Rav Nachman. Metzias Paul liatzmo. So listen to this. If a worker, Paul is a laborer. So let's say I have a worker, and he finds a Metzia. He finds an object. The halacha is he gets to keep it himself. Now, this is actually very interesting. But when is that true? So we'll say that's true if what? If I hired a worker in a very specific way, I tell him, do me a favor, I want you to weed my garden, or I want you to go ahead and plow my field. I hire him for a very specific task. So if I hire him for a specific task and he finds a Metzia during that day, so the Maisa, again, that Metzia belongs to him, the worker. Aval Amar Lo, but if I hire a worker and I say, listen, come work for me for the day. But what I will say, I don't define what the work is. Essentially what I'm saying is, I'm hiring you for the day, and I have the right to assign you whatever tasks I want. So we'll say, in a situation like that, I, so to speak, have not ownership, because you can never have ownership over another Jew, but I have rights over all of his labor that day, is Maaseh Adayim that day, and therefore again, Mitziaso Shal Balabayasu. But say in that case, Talocha is what? That if he finds a Metzia, that Metzia actually belongs to the Balabas. Now, both say that this contradicts what Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda just said before, because here you have a case of where what? When the Poel picks up the Metzia, who is going to acquire it? The Balabas. But yet Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda said, Hamagbia Metzia lechavero, lo kana chavero. So what's going on over here? Amarle shiny Poel, diyodu kad balabais. No. The difference is that when I hire someone for the day to work for me, his hand is like my hand. In other words, he's considered to be an extension of me. But 1 second, Amarav, Poel yachal achzerbo. But is that true that my Poel, my worker, is an extension of me? There's a very important halacha, which is that a laborer could choose to walk off the job at any time. So if my labor is an extension of me, then again, how could he walk off the job at any time? To which the Gemara says, we actually quoted this last week. Now again, I just want to be clear, in this case, he might be chayav certain damages to me, right? Meaning if I hire someone to do a job, yes, he has the absolute legal right to walk off the job at any point in time. If he causes me damages, he may be chayav for that, but Lamaisa, he always has the right to walk off the job. So how can you say that he's an extension of the balabas if he can walk off the job at any time? To which the Gemara says, no. Amarle, kol kama de lo haderbe kad balabayasu. You're right. What it means is, while he's in the employment of the balabas, he is like an extension of the balabas. That's why if you hire a worker and you tell him, listen, work for me for the day, and you don't specify what labor, you're just going to give him whatever you want him to do, then Lamaisi is an extension of me, of the employer, and if he finds a Metzia, it belongs to the employer. So the Gemara says, Ki haderbe, taimachrini dichsiv. And the reality is, he's able to walk off the job for a whole other reason. Dichsiv, because the pasuk says, Ki li b'nei Yisrael avodim, Avodaihem. So we'll say because the pasuk says, Kosh Baruch Hu says to Klal Yisrael, because Bnei Yisrael are my avodim. Kosh Baruch Hu says they're my avodim, v'lo avodim la avodim. So we'll say Klal Yisrael, we are avodim to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but we are never avodim to another person. the idea that if a laborer was unable to walk off a job, that would be a form of servitude. So therefore, again, the halacha is he always has the right to walk away. But until he has not walking away, in other words, until while he's in the employ of the employer, then Mamaisa, again, his hand is like the balabas's hand. That's why if he finds a Metzia, he's able to acquire it. Amr Rabbi Abba, Amr Rabbi Yochanan, Hamakbia Metzia Chavera Kana Chavera. So we'll say, so now Rabbi Abba is in Rabbi Yochanan, that they argue on Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda, that if you go ahead and you lift up a Metzia for your friend acquires it. I ve'in tomar Mishnah seinu. But I will say, what do you do about our Mishnah? Because our Mishnah contradicts that idea. Because remember what happened in our Mishnah? Reuven's on the animal, Shimon's on foot. Reuven says to Shimon, can you give me that Metzia? Can you give me that Metzia? Pick it up for me. And Shimon picks it up, and then he says, what? I thank you very much. I cried on behalf of myself that it works. But if you hold that Amakbia Metzila Chavero Kana Chavero, then the moment Shimon picks it up, Reuven should acquire it. To which the Gemara says, no, our Mishnah is not a kasha. Damar Tneli velo Amar Zochali. Well, so here's the distinction. If you look in the wording of the Mishnah was where Reuven on the animal says to Shimon on foot, can you please go ahead and give me that object? So say the mashmosa, give me that object is, I'm not asking for you to acquire, I'm not asking Shimon to acquire it on my behalf, I'm asking him to hand it to me, and I will acquire it myself. In a case like that, where the Ma'aseh Kinyan is going to be done by Reuven, then Einach Shimon has the ability, if he wants, to acquire it on his behalf. And I will say, this is the halacha. Listen to this. The Shulchan Aruch writes, this is in Choshen Mishpat, Simen Reish Samech Tes Sif Vav. Hayrochi v'agabi behema v'ras hamatzia. We'll say Reuven's riding on an animal, or I'm riding on an animal, and I see an object on the ground. I say to my friend who's walking by me, Zocha li ba, acquire it for me. Kevan sheik bialo kana harochiv afal pishlo yeliado. Both say the halacha is we paskin hamagbia lachavero kana chavero. So if I ask Reuven to acquire it, the wording of the Shulchan Aruch is very important. Zocha li ba. Acquire it for me. The moment that Reuven picks it up he acquires it on my behalf, and it is mine, even though it has not yet come into my possession. However, v'im amarli teneli. But if I said to Reuven, can you please hand me that object? V'notla Shimon, thank you. Well, I'm on the animal, right? So I say to Reuven, go ahead, hand it to me. And what happens? V'notla v'amar aniza chisiba. And then what happens? Reuven is picking it up on my behalf, says, I acquired it for myself. Zacha bahanotel. Ultimately, again, Reuven, the guy who picked it up, has the ability to go ahead and acquire it on his behalf. But if he handed it off to me, and then he said, I acquired it on my behalf, such a statement ultimately is meaningless. So we'll say that indeed is halacha l'maisa. Says the Mishnah. Another interesting case, we'll say, I see an object on the ground, and what happens? I fall on top of it. I throw myself on top of it, right? So obviously I'm doing this as a way of acquiring the object. So I literally throw myself on top of it. And then what happens? As I'm laying on top of the object, Reuven comes along, pulls it out from under me, and does hagbah. So what's talacha? So what's that? The guy who picks it up and acquires it is the owner of the object. In other words, what the Mishnah is just simply saying is, laying on top of something is not a valid form of kinyan. So therefore, the mice again, even though you're laying on top of it, you do not acquire it. Says the Gemara, Amar Reish Lakish Mishum Abba Kohen Bardula. Reish Lakish said the name of Abba Kohen Bardula. Arba Amo Shal Adam Konos Lo B'Chol Makom. We'll say an important halacha. A person's dalet amis acquire on his behalf. Right? Each of us are given dalet amis. And those dalet amis, essentially, we'll say those dalet amis work as my chotzer. So they acquire on my behalf. My time, what's the reason? My time at Takin Rabbanon. Why did the rabbis institute that every single person has their own dalet amis? So that people shouldn't quarrel. The idea, we'll say, is that since it's known that I have my own dalet amis, people kind of give each other personal space, recognizing that whatever is in my dalet amis, I'm able to acquire. Amar Abaye, Mosir Rav Chiya bar Yosef, Amar Abaye, Mosir Rav Chiya bar Yosef, Peah. So Abaye said, well, Rav Chiya bar Yosef brought a question about this principle from Peah. Amar Rava, Mosir Rav Yaakov bar Idi Nezikin. Rava said that Rav Yaakov bar Idi brought a question on this from Nezikin. What are the questions? Amar Abaye, Mosir Rav Chiya bar Yosef, Peah. So Abaye said Rav Chiya bar Yosef brought a question on this from Peah. What's the case of Peah? Natal Miktsas Peah, V'zarak ala Shabbos. Listen to this case. I'm picking Peah. Remember, Peah refers to the corner of the field that is left for the poor. So I took some payah, I cut down some payah, and I took the cut payah and I threw it on the standing payah. So what I did is, I want to reserve some payah for myself. So I cut down some payah, I take, let's say, the cut grain, and I throw it on top of the standing grain. So essentially what I'm doing is, I'm covering the standing grain with the cut grain as a way of demonstrating my ownership. This is reserved, this is for me. So what's the halacha? Ein lo ba klum. We'll say, so that doesn't acquire anything. Meaning throwing cut grain that you acquired over standing grain that you did not acquire as a way of acquiring the standing grain does not work. However, not a nafal lo aleh. But we'll say, if let's say I lay down on top of the standing grain, or paras taliso alav, or I spread my talis, my cloak, over the grain, then what's the halacha? Ma'virin osehemena. So we'll say the halacha is we take the pay away from the individual. In other words, same thing, that you can't acquire payah by laying down on top of it. You can't acquire payah by putting your cloak on top of it. V'chein ba'omer shechacha. We'll say the same thing would apply to a sheaf or to a stalk of shechacha, right? So shechacha refers to grain that's forgotten or left behind in the field. Same halacha would apply. In other words, it's not just a din by standing grain, it's a din by cut grain as well. So we'll say the idea being, this seems to echo what we just said in the Mishnah, namely, in order to acquire something, you have to lift it up. But the act of laying down on top of something, or even spreading your cloak on top of something, doesn't acquire. Look what the Gemara's kasha is. The amrit arba amos shal adam konos lo b'chol makom niknu le arba amos didei. But I don't understand, if you tell me that my dalet amos acquire, then what? Let's say again, let's say I'm standing in, let's take the case of the shechacha. It's the easiest case. I go ahead and the owner of the field leaves behind a sheaf of wheat. So it's on the ground. I want to acquire it. So the Mishnah told, so the Brisa just told me, if I lay down on top of it, or if I spread my cloak on top of it, it doesn't work. I have a simpler idea. Let me just stand next to it. And once I stand next to it, what? Dalet amos kona. My dalet amos acquire it. So why? So yet again, the Brisa does not say that, which would seem to indicate that my dalet amos are not kona. Hacham askinon. What's the case? Delo amar akni, where a person did not say, let my dalet amos acquire. In other words, the Gemara's havamina is that in order for dalet amos to acquire, what has to happen? They almost have to be activated. You have to activate your dalet amos. How do you activate your dalet amos? My dalet amos acquire on my behalf. But if I didn't say that, then they're not activated. So what are you talking about? Kilo Omer Havi. I don't understand. If the rabbis instituted that something should work, then why would you have to activate it? Meaning it's activated me'ilov. It's activated by itself, even if I don't say anything. Kevan, to which the Gemara says, you're right. Kevan denafal gali daite de benafila nechale the nikni ba'arba amos lo nechale the nikni. So also listen to this. To which the Gemara says, but since a person is falling on top of the grain, the act of falling on top of the grain is tantamount to saying what? I don't want my dalet amos to acquire the item because I'm actively trying to acquire the item through a different mechanism, i.e. through nefila. So what the Gemara is suggesting is like this. Inochinam, you're right. Dalet amos will work by themselves without any formal, we'll call it, verbal activation. But if it's clear from your actions that you are relying on another form of kinyan to acquire, then it's as if you're saying, what? I don't want my dalet amos to acquire on my behalf because I'm using a different mechanism. Since the mechanism you're using in this case is a flawed one, i.e. laying down on top of the object, therefore you do not acquire the wheat, the payah. I'm a base. Rav Papa says, Ki takinu le'rabbanan arba amos ba'almo. Rav Papa says, no, there's a different issue. Yes, it's true, the rabbis went ahead and instituted dalet amos. And the rabbis also said, the Rabbanan also said that you need not activate your dalet amos with in some type of verbal declaration. Rather, again, dalet amos are activated on their own. When did the Rabbanan activate dalet amos? That's ba'alma. Both say in general. However, in general, we'll see what that means. Besaded de balabayis lo takinu le Rabbanan. Both say you don't have dalet amos in someone else's field. As we'll discuss, you have dalet amos in generally owned property, right? Publicly owned property. Someone else's. When I go in to pick payah, right? Where's that payah? That payah is in someone's privately held property. You don't have dalet amos in somebody's privately held property. And even though the rabbis did give me some right in the private property, that's a right. We'll Ulanakute peah. Let me have a chatzero lo zachi b'Rabbanan. Lo zachi le'rachman. Excuse me. So we'll say, what rights do I have in someone else's property? I have a right that I'm not trespassing. I have a right to traverse the field to get to the peah. That's my right. I have a right to get into the field. I have a right to get out of the field. I have a right to pick the peah. But the Rabbanon never instituted Dalit Amis in someone's field. That's why, again, your Dalit Amis can't work to go ahead and acquire peah on your behalf, because there is no Dalit Amis in privately held property.
Why not? Because you could have Hagbah in someone else's property, so you're making a kinyan, so this is a form of conditional kinyan. For peah, for sure.
Oh, because the difference is that Hagbah is bringing it onto yourself. Well, actually, see, the Gemara is going to talk about that. There's a chiluk between Dalit Amis, even though they both sound like your own person, but we're going to see a chiluk between Hagbah and Dalit Amis. Good. Baruch Shekivanto. Amar Rava, Moshe Rav Yaakov Bar Idi. So we'll say, so that was the first kasha. That was the first kasha. Amar Rava. So we'll say, so first of all, there are a couple of important takeaways here. Takeaway number one is that Lamaisa, again, Dalit Amis works even if it's not even if it's not verbally activated. That's number one. Number two, you don't have Dalit Amis in privately held property. That's number two. What else do we see? Amar Rava. Most Rav Yaakov Bar Idi Nezikin. So Rava said Rav Yaakov Bar Idi brought the kasha from Nezikin. What was the case of Nezikin? Ras Hametzia v'nafalo aleha. So we'll say the case over here was I see a Metzia. This is our Mishnah. I see a Metzia, and I fall on top of it. Right? Literally, I lay down on top of the Metzia, and obviously my intention of laying down on it is what? Is to go ahead and acquire it. Someone then comes along and what? Pulls the object out from under me and acquires it. So, meaning, does a chazaka, meaning, does hakba. The one who lifted it up, ultimately, again, acquires the object. V'i amrit arba amos shel adam konos v'chol makom. Niknu le arba amos didei. But I don't understand if at the end of the day Dalit Amos acquire. If Dalit Amos acquire, see, even if you want a taina, that's what. Let's say laying down on something does not affect kinyan. But if I'm laying down on something, then what is absolutely clear? The object is where? The object is in my Dalit Amos. So why don't my Dalit Amos acquire? Hacham askina delo amar akni. Suppose the Gemara is going to go through the same process as before. The case is where the guy never said, "Let my Dalit Amos acquire on my behalf." I would ask the Gemara v'takon rabbanon kilo amr my havi. I don't understand. If the rabbis instituted something, namely a Dalit Amos should work, who cares if you say something or not? L'maisa, again, once there is a rabbinic, once there is this rabbinic entitlement, we'll call it the Dalit Amos, that should be activated by itself. To which the Gemara says, no. Kevan denafal alei galei daiti debenefilo nechalei denikni be'arba amos lo nechalei denikni. We'll say the problem over here in this case is when I lay down on the object, it's almost as if I'm making a declarative statement that I want this act of nefila to acquire the object, and I do not want my Dalit Amos to acquire it on my behalf. Rav Shesha says there's a different issue. Ki takinu rabbanon besimta delo dochki rabim. Birshas harabim the kadochki rabim lo takin rabbanon. Both says actually very interesting. Rav Shesha says, when do you have Dalit Amos? So both say so. So remember again, we just said before, you don't have Dalit Amos ultimately in privately held property. You know where else you don't have Dalit Amos? In Rosh Hashanah. Both say, because think about this for just a moment. Dalit Amos can't really work in Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because there's too many people there. So where did the Rabbanan institute Dalit Amos? What we call a simta. So what's a simta? Is kind of like the shoulder, like the not an alleyway, but a recessed area off Rosh Hashanah where there is less pedestrian traffic. So on one hand, it is Rosh Hashanah. On the other hand, it's not congested like Rosh Hashanah. So therefore, the Gemara is suggesting over here that the case of Metzia, Nafal ala Metzia, where I fall on top of the Metzia, that case is in Rosh Hashanah. In a case like that, Rabbi say again, I'm at a disadvantage on two levels. Number one, the act of laying down on top of something does not acquire it on my behalf, and number two, there are no Dalit Amos in Rosh Hashanah proper because there's too much pedestrian traffic. So therefore, that's why I don't acquire the item at all. The Gemara says, but one second. But we just learned before that the Brisa said that what? That the rabbis instituted that a person has Dalit Amos b'chol makom. The Rebbe says, so granted in every place. Now granted in every place, we assume that to mean what? Every publicly owned place, every Rosh Hashanah, To which the Gemara says, no. Kol makom la'asu yetzidi Rosh Hashanah. So we'll say kol makom comes to include even the sides of Rosh Hashanah. But again, it goes without saying that in Rosh Hashanah itself, which is a congested area, you will say there's a very simple level. You can't really say that people acquire things within their own Dalet Amos. Why? Because in Rosh Hashanah, which is a congested area, people often don't have their own Dalet Amos of space. The concept that my Dalet Amos could acquire something of me presupposes that I have some shlita over that Dalet Amos of space. But in congested areas where there's no shlita, I have no control over my Dalet Amos, they can't acquire. We'll say, in other words, talking a little bit about Kinyanim. So Reish Lakish said in the name of Abba Kohen Bardala, Kitana in Lachatzer, a Kitana Rabosai, a girl who is a minor, does not have a Chatzer. In other words, does not have, we assume that means does not have Kinyan Chatzer, Ve'in La Arba Amos, nor does she have the ability to acquire something in her Dalet Amos. Rabbi Yochanan Mishram Yanai Amar Yesh Lachatzer, Ve'yesh La Arba Amos. On the other hand, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yanai, or say Rabbi Yochanan is the name of Rabbi Yanai, she has Chatzer, and she has Dalet Amos. But my comifigis, so we'll say, so what are they arguing about? So one opinion says, a Ketana has no Chatzer, has no Dalet Amos. Second opinion says she has Chatzer, she has Dalet Amos. What are they arguing about? Mar Savar Chatzer Mishum Yada Israboi. So we'll say, so the first opinion says, second opinion says that Chatzer, the ability of a Chatzer to acquire, is an extension of one's yad. Chatzer is an extension of my hand. So ki'echi de isle yad. So let's remember, a Ketana has a yad. Remember we learned in Gittin, Rashi points this out. Rashi says the halacha is you can give a get to and say a man's married to a Ketana, you can give a get to a Ketana as long as what? As long as she has the ability to guard that get in her hand. She has the ability, as long as she has the ability. So therefore again, if you hold that Chatzer is an extension of Yad, the same way she has Yad, so she'll have Chatzer as well. Keiche de isla Yad, Chatzer nami isla. Umar savar Chatzer mishum shlichos israboy. But the other opinion says that shlichus ultimately that Chatzer is really a function of shlichus. V'chi hechi the shlichus lesla, and it was in the same way that she doesn't have shlichus. In the same way that she doesn't have shlichus, then what? Chatzer nami lesla. She doesn't have Chatzer either. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, mi ika man da amar Chatzer mishum shlichus israboy. Is there anyone who holds that Chatzer is an extension or Chatzer is a function of shlichus? Everyone holds that Chatzer is an extension of yad. V'hatanya biado. The pasuk says biado, in his hand. In other words, this is talking about by Geneva, by the theft, by kefil. You have to pay kefil if you find the theft biado. Inli ella biado. I only know in his hand. Gago chatzero karfifa minayin. How do I know that if it's in his property, he's chayiv for that as well? Tamalomar himatze timatze b'chol makom. Therefore, the pasuk says the double lashon rabos. It says wherever you find it. Now, what do you see from here? You see from here that Chatzer is learned out from Yodo. So you see, therefore, that Chatzer is an extension of one's hand. So if Chatzer is an extension of one's hand, then the Ketana should have the ability to acquire through Chatzer as well. To which the Gemara says, V'isar daitra Chatzer mishum shlichus israboy im kematzinu shliach lidvar avera. Oh, so the Gemara says something very interesting over here. I was saying, if you hold that shlichus is an extension, that Chatzer is a function of shlichus, then it turns out that what? That you have a case of yesh shliach lidvar avera. Now remember, under normal circumstances, we say, Ein shliach ledvar avera. There's no such thing as a shliach for the commission of a sin. The person who commits the avera is himself personally responsible. But if you hold that a chatzer is a form of shlichus, that means when my chatzer acquires a stolen object, that there's a concept of yesh shliach ledvar avera v'kaimalon, and I will say we learned ein shliach ledvar avera, that there is no such thing as a shliach ledvar avera. There is no agency for the commission of a sin. To which the Gemara says, Amar Avina, Heicha Amrinan de Shliach Ledvar Avera. When do we say there's no agency for Avera? Heicha de Shliach Bar Chiyuvahu. We'll say that's only when the agent himself is a Bar Chiyuva. Well, look at Rashi. Bar Chiyuvahu, Sha'af hu Musar ala Davar, Hasam Pater HaShaleach. Damrinan le, Divrei Harad, V'divrei HaTalmid, Divrei Mishomah. So we'll say, when do we say in Shliach Ledvar Avera? That's when the Shaliach possesses das. Because then we say to the shaliach, so, what are you doing carrying out this agency? You know it's an avera. You are following orders. That's very nice. But Lamais, at the end of the day, when you know what's right, you know what's wrong. The fact that somebody told you to do something, that's not an excuse. You should know better. Aval b'chatzar delav bar chiyuvahu mechayev sholcho. Rabosai, a chatzar, obviously, which doesn't have das. So when the chatzar, so to speak, does something or acquires something on behalf of the owner, it will be the sholech, it will be the owner of the chatzar who will be chayev for that. Ela me'ata ha'omer le'isha ve'evet se'u ganvuli telav b'nei chiyuvaninu ha'chanami di'mechayev shochan. So we'll say, if that's the case, are you going to tell me then if I tell a woman or a slave to go ahead and steal something from me, since they are not financially responsible, so too again, I the mishalech will be chayiv. To which the Gemara says, first of all, what does that mean? They're not responsible. Amrit isha ve'eved b'nei chiyuvaninu. It's not true. If a woman or a slave steals something, they are chayiv. There's a technical issue. V'hashta miha les lahu l'shalume. The difficulty we'll say is what? Is that l'maisa again, often they do not have the possessions with which to be able to pay back. This now, and that's why we learned, Neskar Sha Isha Nishtachra Eved Chayavin L'Shalim. That's why, we'll say, in the event that a woman is divorced, in which case now she has a property settlement, or an Eved is freed, in which case he has Hanok, he's also given money, they are chayiv to repay anything they stole. So we'll say, so according to Ravina, the only time we say Ein Shliach L'Dvar Aveira is when the Shaliach has das. The shliach has das, then again he's responsible for his own actions, and even though he could say, I was following orders, Lamais, at the end of the day, he was responsible for his actions. So let's just read one more line and then we'll stop. Rav Sama Amar, Heicha Aminan Ein Shliach L'Dvar Aveira. So Rav Sama says, when do we say Ein Shliach L'Dvar Aveira? That's Heicha Di'i Boy Ovid, V'i Boy Lo Ovid. When do we say Ein Shliach L'Dvar Aveira? That's when the shliach has a choice. When the shliach has a choice about what to do, then if he chooses to commit the Aveira, it's considered as if he's acting on his own volition. Aval chotzer, the Bal Karche Mosiv Bey, but a chotzer, obviously, which has no choice, and just acquires, so to speak, against its will, so to speak, then Mechayiv Sholcho. Ultimately, again, the owner of the field will be responsible for the acquisition of any illegal items through his chassid. So we'll stop over here for today. We're going to pick up with this machlokes tomorrow. But again, we end up with the fascinating machlokes, Ravina and Rav Sama, both agreeing, Ein Shliach L'Dvar Aveira, disagreeing on the mechanics of it. Ravina says because we only apply Ein Shliach L'Dvar Aveira in a case of das, and ultimate, or I should say, bar chiyuv, where the person himself is responsible not to commit the aveira. And Rav Sama says only in a case where there's choice. Now it sounds like they're saying the same thing, but Metzia will pick up tomorrow morning with the nafkamina between these two shitos.
Right. Can't say you're following orders.
Can't say you're following orders. That's lamaisa. Very true.